One morning in December 2015, I was in my home office reading an article about the mass shooting in San Bernardino, California, that took the lives of 14 innocent civilians. While I was reading, my son came to me, as he usually does when he wants something. He probably noticed that I was engaged in the article, and so he stood next to me and started reading along. After I finished and turned toward him, my son started asking questions. Who are these bad guys? Are they really Muslim? Why are they doing that? My son kept pressing me for answers, and I found myself incapable of explaining why someone would commit such violence against innocent people. After thinking deep and long about this, I realized that the only thing I could tell my son is that this horrible act cannot be explained because it doesn't make sense. It's irrational. About 2 weeks later, my son asked if we could move to Turkey. His request was surprising because we visited Turkey twice before, and he wasn't particularly thrilled with the experience. Plus, he's very attached to his country, the United States. For example, when we play the FIFA game together on PlayStation, he always insists on being the US team. He identifies himself as American rather than Syrian, although his mother and I were both born in Syria. I asked him why he wanted to go to Turkey. It turned out that one of his classmates had told him that a politician is planning to ban all Muslims from entering the US. This was another moment where I couldn't find words to explain a nonsensical situation to my son. The proposed ban, I told him, is irrational because it assumes that religion causes violence. It establishes this causal relationship based on biases rather than on facts, which is not the right way to arrive at logical conclusions. I told him, though, that a proposal to ban more than 1.5 billion people based on their beliefs can only be made by arrogant people who feel entitled to judge others based on their own prejudices rather than based on what's right or moral. I, my son, and millions of other people are affected by these two alarming trends: acts of violence and voices of arrogance. Acts of violence committed by or under the name of the self-proclaimed Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, are on the rise. Similarly, voices of arrogance, traditionally represented by right-wing populists and right-wing media, have become clearly visible in the US 2016 elections with their frequent slandering of minority groups, particularly Muslims. These acts of violence and voices of arrogance have been widely and globally denounced. They continue to grow. As a researcher of linguistics, I'm interested in comparing the discourses behind the acts of violence and voices of arrogance. More specifically, I'm interested in the striking similarities between them. When I say discourse, I'm referring to speeches and texts that are accepted as reality by a large part of a given society. Discourses are created and understood through language, which I think is one of the most significant tools and weapons we humans possess. To many observers, the discourses supporting ISIL and the discourses supporting right-wing populists may seem completely opposite to each other. In fact, there's a striking similarity between them. The nature of the discourses of violence and the discourses of arrogance is linked in 6 important ways. First, the discourses of violence and arrogance are both built on fear and hate. Since the tragic 9/11 attacks and subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, one of the common questions in the Middle East as well as in the United States is, why do they hate us? This topic has developed into a main theme in the discourse of violent groups. Their argument is that America's interventions in the Middle East are a war upon Muslims because of their religious affiliation rather than anything else. A similar style of discourse has been used by American right-wing populists and media, where the argument is that Muslims hate America because of its democratic ideals and freedom. Some politicians have used fear and hate speech to gain more supporters. In a recent interview on CNN, Mr. Donald Trump stated that Islam hates us. Using fear is a very common political tactic. But as the famous philosopher Michel Foucault said, fear creates realities often distant from actual world events. Second, the discourses of violence and arrogance undermine the ideals of the groups they claim to represent. While ISIL claims to represent Sunni Muslims, most of the victims of its violent attacks are Sunni Muslims. In the past few years, ISIL has claimed tens of bombings targeting Sunni Muslims in Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. One of these bombings targeted Prophet Muhammad's mosque in Saudi Arabia, which is considered the second most sacred place to Sunni Muslims. According to the GTD, the world's largest public database on terrorist attacks, 75% of the victims of terrorism between 2001 and 2015 are Muslims, whereas only 2.2% of the victims are European or American. Similarly, the discourse of arrogance is against the principles of equal opportunity, justice, and peace upon which the United States is built. It intends to restore America's greatness, while at the same time ignoring the values that made America great in the first place. Third, the discourses of violence and arrogance play on the power of labeling. In the case of ISIL, they often use terms like infidels, crusaders, and apostates to label those who do not follow their ideology and to justify their violent acts against them. Whereas the discourse of the arrogant identifies the other as terrorists, jihadists, or extremists to justify their verbal and physical aggression against them. Labels are used to fix the identity of a vaguely identified other. The power of labels shouldn't be overlooked. Labels are not mere price tags attached to commodities. They have long histories and emotions attached to them. And they are used selectively to demonize the other or to make them less worthy of fair treatment, respect, or even life. Fourth, the discourses of violence and arrogance are built on stereotypes and sweeping generalizations. In the discourse of the violent, Americans are typically presented as irreligious and as hostile to Muslims. On the other side, the media of the American right tries to create a direct link between mainstream Islam and the violent acts done by anyone remotely related to Islam. This implies that unlike other groups, Muslims are senseless beings, driven solely by religious programming and indoctrination. Take the perpetrator of the Orlando mass shooting, Omar Mateen. Though his parents were from Afghanistan, he was described by his ex-wife and some acquaintances as irreligious. The unasked question by the media is how representative is this person of a typical Muslim? Fifth, the discourses of violence and arrogance rely heavily on claims of victimization. The discourse of violence draws attention to America's interventions in the Middle East and its support of corrupt regimes in the region to portray themselves as victims to American imperialism. In the same way, the discourse of the arrogant draws attention to the violent acts of groups like ISIL to argue that America and the West in general are victims to radical Muslims. Both discourses play the victim role. Ironically, the victimization rhetoric is often presented as a justification for retaliatory acts against the other. For example, ISIL leaders have constantly been encouraging indiscriminate attacks in retaliation for coalition airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. Similarly, the retaliatory acts of right-wing populists included proposals for nuking or carpet bombing large areas of the Middle East. Both discourses seem to see no problem in targeting innocent civilians. In other words, the discourse of violence and the discourse of arrogance encourage unjustifiable acts based on what they see as justifiable causes. Lastly, the discourses of violence and arrogance mainly target vulnerable groups. I believe that the main common attribute of the shooters in San Bernardino, Orlando, Paris, and Nice is not that they are Muslim, but that they have a troubled history, something that they share with many lawbreakers, regardless of their religion. In fact, Lydia Wilson from Oxford University reported that the majority of ISIL fighters in Syria and Iraq had gone through horrific experiences before they joined this group. This, of course, doesn't justify their crimes, but it shows how vulnerable groups can be easily manipulated for a variety of unworthy causes. Similarly, the arrogant discourse of right-wing populists serves Americans who no longer feel secure about their advantages in the American society and who have lost hope in the future. Vulnerable groups may embrace the discourses of violence or arrogance, not necessarily because they agree with them, but because they present them with a window of hope or a way to reclaim their status. The discourses of violence and the discourses of arrogance are more than just words. They are springboards for action, and they are our history in process. They matter because they have the potential to affect the lives and the thinking of generations to come. I've seen their effects already when I heard my own child asked to leave his home country. Since that day, I've been trying to share with him speeches and writings that expose the misconceptions and prejudices underlying the fear-based discourses of ISIL and right-wing populists. I've been trying to show him that there is hope in constructive discourses. Unlike the discourses of violence and arrogance, constructive discourses engage genuinely and sincerely in answering key questions about ideological conflicts, such as the question of why do they hate us? They focus not just on differences, but also in similarities and shared values. They start with the assumption that all humans have hopes, feelings, and basic needs. Constructive discourses allow for multiple perspectives and voices instead of being self-centered. They view others in their full humanity, which is easily lost when they are stripped of their voice. Constructive discourses try to find ways to elevate the self rather than ways to put down the other. I sometimes feel sad to have to engage my 10-year-old son in the politics of language and discourse, but I also want to restore his hope in a better future, where he doesn't feel accountable for crimes he didn't commit, nor does he feel insecure in his own country. I know that those affected directly or indirectly by this conflict, including me, have greater responsibility to encourage and promote these constructive discourses. As a father and as a researcher of linguistics, I've chosen to speak out more broadly. When we make room for constructive discourses, not only do we provide hope for individual people, but we also create a platform for increasing understanding, justice, and peace in the world.
Wahab.